I'm going to talk a little bit today about the emergence of Christmas as a Christian festival in late antiquity, in particular, because it wasn't always from the earliest days. Christmas, as in Christ's birthday, was not really a point of celebration, and in fact, there's very little interest in the first few centuries of Christian texts on the date of Christ's birth at all. And there's some interesting issues that this opens up with in terms of the interaction between Christianity in late antiquity and Greco-Roman religion and the traditional Roman religious calendar. And it goes to the heart of some of those questions which are quite current about the ways in which Christians in antiquity, how they should be conceived of as sort of consumers, but also appropriators and potentially disruptors of classical culture. So in early Christianity, as I said, the birthday of Jesus was not a major interest for first or second century Christians in particular. There's very little focus on that. We do have evidence for celebrations of Jesus's baptism, which was traditionally dated to January 6th. So that's an interest there and for a lot of early Christians, that would be his true birth. That's when the Paraclete descends on him and he's baptized in the Jordan. But Easter was, of course, the major focus of early Christian devotion, the kind of big event in the calendar. And that was actually quite controversial. So early Christians debated whether the timing of Easter should be based on either the traditional Jewish reckoning of the Paschal feast, which was related to the lunar cycle, or whether Easter should be fixed on the Roman calendar. And this is something actually that we'll come back to a few times. The debate or the way in which Roman ways of thinking, Roman ways of organizing time and religious festivals became progressively sort of more and more important in Christian time construction. And the people who pushed that particular interpretation were able to define themselves as Orthodox. So already from the second century, we have a number of sort of anti-heresiological texts arguing against the Jewish method of calculating Easter. And that rumbles on into late antiquity, and basically the people who use the Roman calendar, they're the ones who win out and get to define themselves as Orthodox and their enemies as heretics. One other thing probably just to point out, which is that there's also a bit of interplay between the celebration of Easter, which is, of course, the celebration of, or the commemoration rather, of Christ's death, so kind of his martyrdom day, and then his rebirth. There's some interplay between the early cult of the martyrs, who are also remembered on their feast days related to the day on which they were martyred, which is also conceived of as kind of a birthday because it's also the day that they entered heaven. So for ancient Christians, the martyrs go straight to heaven. Everyone else sleeps in the ground until the resurrection, but the martyrs get to go straight to the good place. And and maybe there's a little bit going both ways. There's this phenomenon called imitatio Christi in early Christian martyrological discourse, where the martyrs are sort of imagined as versions of Christ. And so there's a little bit of back and forth between the sort of the way that Christians think about Easter and early martyrological feast days. So just to think about Christmas a bit now, I mean, any of you who have perhaps, if you've watched The Simpsons, you might remember that bit where Lisa Simpson very pompously tells her family that Christmas was originally the pagan winter solstice and was taken over by Christianity. And that's quite a popular idea in popular discourse on this, the idea that Christianity sort of aggressively appropriated an earlier pagan tradition. And there's some truth in that. And actually that idea, as we'll see, actually comes from a scholarly strand, which began in the late 19th century, and then has become very popular also in popular culture. It's one of those bits of scholarship that really has run away in the popular imagination. And that is an important background to when Christians start thinking about the birthday of Jesus, why they pick, or potentially one of the influences for why December, and particularly December the 25th, ends up being what they focus on. So if we think a little bit about sort of traditional Greco-Roman religion in December, well, the Saturnalia, and lots of people have made comments about how elements for the Saturnalia end up in later elements of a Christmas celebration. The Saturnalia is the big festival, the big Roman festival in December. This is a time of sort of decorating your house in green, for example, so you can see how that might carry over. It's a time of revelry. It's a long period at various times in Roman history, either 3 days, 5 days, or 7 days, always starting on December the 17th. There's lots of drinking. There's giving presents to each other. lots of little figurines. And it's also a time when it's almost a world outside of time. The social order is upturned during the Saturnalia. Slaves get to act like masters and so on and so forth. So there's a little bit of a sort of a carnival, world turned upside down sense to the Saturnalia. But the Saturnalia can't be, we can't just say that Christmas replaced the Saturnalia, because the Saturnalia, as you said, if you do your quick maths there, if it starts on December 17th, Saturnalia always ended before the 25th. What seems to be a slightly sort of riper vein, to mix metaphors quite dramatically, is the idea that Romans thought of December 25th as the winter solstice. And there's a few bits of scattered evidence of this. Some are less specific, some are more specific, but the winter solstice generally seems to be thought of as happening after the Saturnalia, so the time when the sun is obviously at its smallest. And we do have some imperial era evidence that thinks of the winter solstice on the 25th of December as the birthday of the sun. So there's a calendar from the 2nd century by a guy called Antiochus of Athens, who refers to December the 25th as the birthday of the sun and says its light then increases. And so this is where the sun sort of comes into the world. It's at its smallest state, and then it gets bigger and bigger over the next few months. And actually, I'll show you a text. We have this reference in Macrobius's Saturnalia. So actually a late antique text, but writing about this festival. And although he's writing about the Saturnalia rather than the solstice specifically, you see he sort of slips into talking about the winter solstice here. So clearly there's some connection in the Roman mind, even if it's just that they're quite close to each other. And Macrobius says, but the different ages are to be understood with reference to the sun. It is very small at the winter solstice, like the image the Egyptians bring out from its shrine on a fixed date with the appearance of a small infant, since it's the shortest day. Then as the days become progressively longer, by the vernal equinox, it resembles a vigorous young man and is given the form of a youth. Later, full maturity at summer solstice is represented by a beard, by which point it's grown as much as it will grow. Thereafter, as the days become ever shorter, the god is rendered in the fourth shape, like a man growing old. So there, you can easily see the kind of conceptual slippage of birthday of the sun and kind of winter solstice. And this perhaps gets particularly energized in the 3rd century, which is a time when Christianity is growing quite significantly, by the Emperor Aurelian. So Aurelian is, he's a pre-Constantinian emperor, so he's still a pagan, but he's one of these soldier emperors of the 3rd century who sort of knits the empire back together after the period of military anarchy. And he is particularly fond of the cult of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. He presents the sun, Sol, as his kind of companion, his comes, and he institutes, after his victories in the east over the empire of Zenobia, the breakaway empire of Zenobia and Palmyra, he dedicates a temple to Sol Invictus at Rome, which seems to be dedicated on the 25th of December, and he institutes celebratory games for the birthday of Sol Invictus on the 25th. One of the reasons why this is interesting is because it's easy to see a little bit of sort of fellow travel between the cult of Sol Invictus and Christianity in the 3rd century. Because this is a time, arguably, in which, certainly in the traditional formulation, people are sort of losing a bit of faith in the traditional gods or the traditional formulation of the gods. If you want to tie that to, political events, you can say, as many people have, the 3rd century is a very politically turbulent time. There's a high turnover of emperors, there's droughts, there's famine, etc., etc. The empire splits up and is then, as I said, sort of knitted back together. But in the traditional formulation, this leads to a sort of a questioning of some of the traditional gods, or at least a greater sense of their capriciousness. And there's a growing sense, not just from Christianity, but there's a search for perhaps for new gods. So mystery cults become, who have a sort of personal relationship with the devotee, become much bigger in the 3rd century. Christianity can sort of be seen in that world. And there's also a renewed interest on what scholars call henotheism, which is the belief that there is one all-powerful God. So this is a sort of and you see that both in religious evidence, but also in philosophical evidence. People are starting to think about all of those traditional gods that you think of, Zeus, Hera, whatever. They're all just human approximations, human understandings, different human understandings of the one essential Godhead, essentially, the one divine principle of the universe. And solar worship is very much part of that, the idea of the sun as representing this sort of, this perfect sort of guiding principle of the universe. So you can see how that there's kind of it's not a massive leap to go from henotheism to monotheism, to Christian monotheism, especially given ways in which that kind of formulation sounds quite similar to, for instance, Christian descriptions of the logos as the guiding principle of the universe, and also various references to God and or Christ as light. So there's you can see there's some similarities there. And actually, I just said, this was instituted in a big way by Aurelian, but actually it continues a little bit later. And this is a coin of Constantine, so actually the first Christian emperor, in which he's still describing Sol Invictus as his comes, as his companion. So even Constantine, the first Christian emperor, wasn't necessarily seeing a big conflict between these things. And in fact, Constantine's father, Constantius I, is presented in the sources as having initially been a solar worshipper who then converted to Christianity. But I should say that despite this is all quite an attractive hypothesis, at the same time, some people have argued recently that evidence for Christmas replacing a specific existing festival on the 25th is weaker than some scholars used to think. A lot of the evidence, so we know that probably Aurelian's festival was somewhere around this time, but the evidence that specifically places it on the 25th is actually quite a bit later, and is already part of this sort of polemical debate about whether Christianity was taking over earlier festivals. So it's actually quite difficult to unpick, but you will still see lots of work that assumes that the 25th was the date that Aurelian instituted this festival. Before we go on to just what Christians are doing with this then in this period, it's also, I think, worthwhile thinking just a little bit about birthdays as well, because that's part perhaps of the Roman context of an interest in Jesus's birthday. Because unlike the ancient Greeks, who didn't really celebrate private birthdays, the private birthday was a major Roman celebration. So they called that the Dies Natalis. And this was important. It was religiously important because it was the date of your birth was also considered the date of the birth of your genius, your kind of guiding spirit. So and that's the spirit that's going to be propitiated on the birthday itself. And for most people, that is a private affair, but that does bleed over into public life in the imperial period, because the emperor's birthday is something that everyone sort of has to celebrate, or not has to celebrate, but there's that in certain places in civic centers that would be part of public celebration, the emperor's birthday. So and that's perhaps, you can maybe read that a little bit into the context, the idea of birthdays becoming more of a public celebration, obviously religiously inflected as well, when it's the emperor who is, of course, not quite divine, but we have the imperial cult in the imperial period. So there's a semi-divinity about the imperial figure. And on the emperor's birthday, his genius would be sacrificed to publicly. And that maybe that's part of the context of people thinking a bit more about celebrating a birthday of somebody like Jesus. Just some evidence for Roman birthdays then. If you've been to Vindolanda, the fort on Hadrian's Wall, or just a mile south of Hadrian's Wall, you might have seen this letter from the late first century. This is a birthday party invitation from one woman to another. So from Claudia Severa, who was the wife of the commander of a different fort called Aelius Brocchus. The commander was called Aelius Brocchus, not the fort. A different fort on Hadrian's Wall, or near Hadrian's Wall, writing to Lepidina, who was the wife of Cerealis, who was the commander of Vindolanda. And she says, on the third day before the Ides of September, so that's how the Romans did their dates. They kind of counted usually backwards from the next big staging post of the month, as it were. For the day of the celebration of my birthday, I give you a warm invitation to make sure that you come to us to make the day more enjoyable for me by your arrival. So the Romans do care about birthdays. And in Cicero's Catiline oration, the third Catiline oration, he here makes a comparison between the birthday and the day in which he has saved the city by expelling Catiline and revealing the conspiracy. And he says, the day on which we are saved is, I believe, as bright and joyous as on which we are born, because delight at our salvation is assured, while at birth our future is uncertain, and because we are not conscious of our birth, but feel pleasure at our preservation. So now, obviously, here Cicero is doing the typically Ciceronian thing of saying the thing that I've done was even better than that. But that rhetoric also depends on everybody sort of accepting that the birthday is an important event to be thinking about. So the first authors that we have thinking in a serious way about when exactly Jesus was born is Clement of Alexandria. There may well be earlier authors who are lost, but the earliest surviving author is Clement of Alexandria. I should say all of these, I won't go into too much detail how they do this because it's incredibly convoluted. And but Clement of Alexandria, he tries with this complex operation to try and date Jesus's birthday. A lot of this, I should say, depends on Luke's claim in chapter 3 that Jesus was about 30 when he died. All of these authors just ignore the about and just say he was 30, and then obviously you need to decide when you think he was crucified, and then work back from there. And Clement of Alexandria, he seems to plump for January the 6th, 2 BC. Then a couple decades later, we have Hippolytus of Rome trying to do the same thing, and he has 2 attempts. The first of which is unsuccessful. So he first publishes a book called the Canon, which dates Jesus's conception to April the 2nd. And the Canon is all about it's meant to be a text that will allow you to work out the Passover date on any year, but it's demonstrably wrong. So within about 3 years of the date, it starts to go awry. So it's repudiated. He tries again a few years later in 235 with his Chronicon. And here he places, not explicitly, but he places Jesus's conception on March the 25th and assumes a perfect 9-month gestation period. So this is the date, December 25th, for Jesus's birth. And I should say March 25th is important because this is when Hippolytus has decided the world was created on March 25th. And this is also Jesus's death day. This is the day of the Passover, also in the year that Jesus died, in what he thinks was AD 29. So there's a kind of a symmetry here, everything happening in the same month. So beginning of the world, Jesus's conception and Jesus's death all happening on March 25th. Therefore, birth on December the 25th. That's still not super explicit. So you still have to do a little bit of maths to kind of figure that out. The first actually explicit mention of December the 25th as Jesus's birthday comes from this 4th century calendar, which is called the calendar of Philocalus. And it was written in 354, AD 354. And this is a funny manuscript, which actually the original manuscript doesn't survive. This is a copy, but it's a couple of different sort of text stitched together, one of which is a martyrological list. And the martyrological list begins with the explanation that Christ's birth date is, so Christ heads the martyrological list. He's the proto-martyr. And it tells us that he was born on December the 25th. So this seems to have entered the realm of of common knowledge perhaps by this point. And that list, we can date it to, it must have been written by 336. So by the early 4th century, there is an idea that Christ was born on the 25th. Interestingly enough, attached to that list is then a calendar, and the calendar for December, which you have there on the right-hand side, lists the 25th of December as the birth of Invictus. Now, most people have taken that to be a reference to Sol Invictus, that festival instituted by Aurelian, but it doesn't actually say Sol. So obviously, if you want to interpret that as Sol Invictus, then yeah, this is perhaps pretty good evidence for that specific event being sort of taken over by Christmas. But we can't actually be completely sure that it is referring to Sol. It could be some other Invictus. It could even be Christ, right? Christ is also unconquered. He conquered death. He's often described as, he's often represented as the Pantocrator, the all-conquering Christ. So who knows? I mean, this is showing us how murky a sort of evidence is for some of these things. And then, which I'll show you in a second, we do start to get more and more explicit evidence in the 4th century of people thinking of December the 25th as Christ's birthday and as something to celebrate. And just to stop here and maybe think a little bit about the way in which scholars have approached some of this material that I just showed you. So I've talked a bit about it, but just to deal with it explicitly, there are 2 very sort of competing strands of how we should interpret this evidence for the early growth of Christmas. On the one hand, there's what people call the history of religions theory, HRT, and the calculation theory, C. And this debate is very polemical, and it's very it's very sort of determined by what that individual scholar sort of already thinks about the interaction between Christianity and paganism in antiquity. So according to the history of religions theory, and that's the one that's really sort of made its way into the public realm, this is, in the 4th century, we see quite a deliberate hostile takeover of of Christianity of this pre-existing winter solstice celebration, and quite sort of deliberately taking it over and Christianizing it. On the other hand, the calculation theory scholars, who are not all Christian apologists, although some of them are, argue that actually this is a properly independent sort of intellectual program of exactly those kinds of authors we just looked at, Hippolytus and Clement and other people, doing their sort of complex arithmetic and independently, without worrying about, is December 25th is the winter solstice, coming up with that date. And as I said, so this is sort of plugged into a bunch of broader debates over Christian appropriation or Christian engagement with classical myth. So, for example, the similarities between other kinds of resurrection and rebirth myths in antiquity, Dionysius, Mithras, Osiris, and how we should think about Christianity in late antiquity specifically interacting with those myths, and what do we make of the similarities between them? Is this inspiration? These are all just products of the same sort of cultural religious environment? Or is this a deliberate attempt by Christians to make themselves intelligible to other audiences and to assert epistemological control over those other mythologies and art, essentially? And you get very different results to these kind of questions depending on what your assumptions of the sort of basic level of that interaction. So now I'm going to look at one author in particular who's trying to deal with basically convincing his audience of the importance of December 25th. So, because in the 4th century, we have a number of sermons which survive from different authors in the East, or different preachers in the East, who are clearly aware that December the 25th as Christ's birthday is a bit of an innovation, but they are trying to convince their audiences that it's really traditional and that it's come from the West and that the West has been doing this for ages. Now, there maybe is some truth in that, because we saw that Hippolytus of Rome in the early 3rd century, he did seem to argue that Christ's birthday was on the 25th, but there's no sense in Hippolytus's material that was at that time a celebration. And indeed, as we saw, Hippolytus, he was kind of striking out on his own in making that calculation. So, so there does seem to be some rhetorical funniness going on, but we'll see how it's managed. And I should say this picture is of Antioch, the major city of Roman Syria, because our major source for what we're going to look at now is John Chrysostom, who was raised in Antioch. He was instructed in oratory by Libanius, the professor of rhetoric, a pagan professor of rhetoric in the city. He then went off and spent some time being an ascetic monk in the mountains, because that's what people did in that time, but that almost kills him. So then he comes back to Antioch, joins the church, is made a lector, a reader, and then in 386, he is made a priest by Bishop Flavian. And he preaches in Antioch for about 12 years. And we have a lot of material from his time preaching in Antioch. He's one of the most prolific surviving preachers for us of this period, probably taken down by stenographers who were in his audience. And then at the end of that period, he's appointed Archbishop of Constantinople, which doesn't go very well for him. He falls out with the imperial family and is exiled a couple of times and sadly dies in exile. But this is, and this text, Homily on the Date of Christmas, this is probably about a year after John Chrysostom was made priest. So 387, perhaps. Some people think 388 or 389, but early on in his career preaching. And this is on Christmas Day itself, this sermon. And he's clearly trying to convince his audience that this is something that they should be celebrating. So we'll read through some of this now. So he says, "So now we, much more, must leap, rejoice, and be full of wonder and astonishment at the grandeur of God's plan, which exceeds all thought. Think how great it would be to see the sun coming down from the heavens, running on the earth, and sending out its beams on everybody from here. If the sight of such splendor would astound all who behold it, consider and contemplate how great it is to see the Sun of Righteousness sending out beams from our own flesh and illuminating our souls." So this is he kind of opens the sermon with this metaphor, or this of Christ or God to the sun here. And interestingly, I mean, that perhaps clues us into a bit of the context here. Chrysostom seems aware that his audience will associate this time, particularly with the solstice, with the sun, with the celebration of the sun. And he's trying to ask them to redefine that slightly and say, not literally the sun, but, the metaphorical sun, the light of the world. Christ is what we should be celebrating here. But clearly, there's some proximity still here in his mind between What he's arguing is Christ's birthday and the solstice or solar worship. And then he explicitly acknowledges the recency of this tradition. He says, although it's not yet the 10th year since this day became clear and familiar for us, through your zeal, it has now flourished as though it was given from the beginning many years ago. Because of this, no one would be far wrong in saying that it's both new and old. New because it has only recently been made known to you, old and venerable because it has swiftly become similar in stature to days long recognized, and it feels as though it is of similar age to them. Now, this is quite a sort of tricky line that Chrysostom is trying to thread here, because it's very important in Roman thinking, Greco-Roman thinking about ancestral tradition, that it be traditional, that it have some kind, that it is ancient. But he can't pull that off here. He knows that Christmas hasn't been celebrated in Antioch for, he says, not more than 10 years, so probably between 5 and 10 years. So it is an innovation. He can't get away from that. But he's saying, but really, this is a really old tradition that we're buying into. And it seems now like it has this great tradition behind it. So he's trying to kind of have his cake and eat it. And then this is his explanation for how that happened. He says, this day was known from the beginning to those in the West. Now it has been brought to us, and before the passing of many years has swiftly shot up, bearing such fruit as you now see. The precincts full and the church packed with the crowd who have gathered together. Expect a repayment worthy of such zeal from Christ, who is born today in the flesh. So his way of sort of squaring this is by saying, okay, well, it's new for us, but this is actually a really traditional observance in the West. They've been doing it in the West from the beginning. And then he explicitly refers to the dissension, the debate that this has caused. He says, I well know that many are still debating with each other about it, some arguing against, some for. Everywhere there's a lot of conversation about this day, some saying accusingly that the day is a new innovation, which has only recently been introduced, while others contend that it is ancient and venerable, that the prophets spoke in advance about his birth, and that from the beginning it was plain and clear to those living from Thrace to Cadiz. So, that idea that it's all over the West. So, and we've already seen that this is a bit of a sleight of hand, that even in the West, there was not only was there not any really interest in Jesus's birthday in the first couple of centuries, but there definitely wasn't any celebration. So even if we want to say at the earliest, this started in Rome, perhaps in the 3rd century, it's still not as old as John Chrysostom is trying to convince his audience of. But this attempt, this is quite sort of common in Chrysostom's rhetoric, trying to redefine certain festivals as purely Christian and really stop his audience going to Jewish and pagan festivals. There's quite a lot of that kind of rhetoric in Chrysostom, which tells us that these groups are still all they're more porous in reality than they are in the rhetoric of the church fathers, people like this. And then Chrysostom, he's still aware people might not believe him. People still think this is a bit new. So he then goes into a number of what he calls proofs. Now, some of these are pretty unconvincing. So one of his proofs is just that the prophets said that all of this, Christ's birth and everything, was going to be proclaimed far and wide, and everyone was going to know it. So the fact that everyone now does know this, that 25th of December was his birthday, means it must be true. So I'm not too sure we can follow him on that one. But he then shows the second proof, which is quite interesting, and brings me to another theme and this question of sort of Roman authority and Christian tradition in this period. He says, what nature is the second proof? He says, the one from the census, which is found in the Gospels. And he's referring here to Luke chapter 2, which is, of course, the census, the Roman census, is an integral part of Luke's nativity story, because it's Luke's explanation for how Jesus of Nazareth came to be born in Bethlehem, which is important for Luke because of various prophecies in the Hebrew Bible, for example, in Micah, which prophesy that the Messiah will come from Bethlehem, from the house of David, and Bethlehem is the ancestral home of the house of David. So Luke says, in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first census and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria. All went to their own towns to be registered. Joseph also went from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David called Bethlehem, because he was descended from the house and family of David. He went to be registered with Mary, to whom he was engaged and who was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for her to deliver her child. And she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in bands of cloth and laid him in a manger, because there was no place in the guest room. Now, there's some truth in this account of Luke, and there's some untruth. So there was a census of Syria by the governor Quirinius, who was the legate of Syria. And Judea was involved in that, because Judea had just been annexed by Rome, and it was incorporated. It was sort of treated as a subdivision of the province of Syria. So Quirinius's census, which he held in 6 to 7 AD, would have included Judea and therefore Bethlehem. Where Luke is being a little bit more iffy with the truth here is, first of all, that Nazareth was in the Galilee, which was not part of the Roman Empire in this period. It was still under the Herodian kings, and would not have been included in the census. And there's no reason why Mary and Joseph would need to leave Nazareth to move to Bethlehem in order to be registered. They could have just stayed in Nazareth. So that seems to be a little bit of a literary construction. And also, we know that this census was not universal. There's no evidence for a universal provincial census. So when the Romans counted all of the citizens in the empire, that was universal. That happened every now and again. But these provincial censuses, which were about finding out the population of a particular census and assessing the tax liabilities of that province, they were just done on a provincial basis. So it's not universal. But this does key us into an important part of Lucan rhetoric, which is important in later Christian construction as well, which is that the Roman Empire is somehow a vehicle for Christians' growth, particularly in the New Testament, particularly in Luke and in the book of Acts, also written by Luke. He's very insistent on this idea that Roman institutions sort of work hand in hand with Christianity. And here it's the Roman institution of the census that brings Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. And this idea of universality is important as well, because just as Christ is the universal sort of ruler of the cosmos, this happens within a universal empire, a supposedly universal empire, due to a universal census. So those ideas are all very current here. So back to John Chrysostom in the 4th century. And so he quotes that passage we just looked at from Luke. He says the proof from the census, which is found in the Gospels. And then he goes on to say, it's clear from this that he was born during the first census. And it's possible for one who desires to know exactly to read the original codices publicly stored at Rome and learn the time of the census. So what, someone says, is this to us, who are neither there nor present, because we're in Antioch, a long way away from Rome? But listen, and do not be unbelieving, because we have received the day from those who know these things accurately and who dwell in that city. So you can see the kind of stages of Chrysostom's argument there. He says, well, this is actually an old tradition, because it's Western, it's Roman, and we're just taking it over. And we know it must be true because the census would have recorded the date of Jesus's birth, and the Romans wouldn't have done something if the census showed something else. And they can obviously read it because they're in Rome. So he's not claiming to have read it himself, but you can see there's a couple of stages to this argument. And I just think it's a really interesting sort of rhetorical maneuver. And of course, no Roman author of this period makes any reference to having access to the census data. So this is clearly going on a little bit in Chrysostom's head, but it's part of his claim of why we should listen to this. And this goes hand in hand with that point I just made about Luke seeing the Roman Empire as somehow a vehicle for Christianity, because this mention of Chrysostom, where he talks about, go and look at the Roman archive, you can look at the census data yourself. This is part of actually quite a long tradition of early Christian authors making appeals to Roman authority figures, to witnesses, to documents and archives that supposedly support the Christian message, or their own particular interpretation of the Christian message. So one example that you might be familiar with is early Christian martyr texts, many of which are framed as court documents, as if they are Roman judicial records that have been extracted from the archives or copied from the archives. They're using the machinery of the Roman justice system in order to prove those text claims about the martyrs' fortitude in front of persecuting governors and things like that. We also see other kind of appeals to administrative records, which we'll look at one in a second. That's actually very similar to the Chrysostom one. We see the interpretation of good emperors as witnesses for Christianity, people who tried to protect Christianity. And as we just said, we see starting in Luke Acts, but then continuing all the way through a lot of the early Christian apologists and into Eusebius of Caesarea's ecclesiastical history, we see lots of descriptions of empire itself as a vehicle for Christian growth. And another good example of this is actually Orosius, the early 5th century author, who argues on the basis of the census that Jesus was enrolled as a Roman citizen at birth under Augustus. So he's part of this universal empire. That is also clearly not true. Jesus was not a Roman citizen. But just to show the sort of the history of this type of rhetorical maneuver, we meet in Justin Martyr, a mid-2nd century author who was actually writing at Rome. So he's writing in the 150s at Rome here, writing his apology, his defense of Christianity, which is directed to the Roman emperors, a very, very similar reference to the Roman archive that we just saw in John Chrysostom. So he's here, he's actually talking about exactly that prophecy from Micah that I talked about, the Messiah coming from Bethlehem. And he then says, this, Bethlehem, is a village in the territory of the Jews, 35 stadia from Jerusalem, in which Jesus Christ was born, as you are able to learn from the census lists made under Quirinius, your first procurator in Judea. So this idea that you could authenticate aspects of Jesus's birth by reference to the census data is very old. None of these people can claim to have seen it. Not even Justin Martyr, who's writing in Rome, claims to actually have the census data. He just assumes it's this idea of the Roman archive being so powerful, right? So these are all authors who are accepting a lot of aspects of Roman imperial ideology. And they are accepting, I think sincerely, the idea that the emperor sees everything and has eyes and ears everything and collects all information on the empire in Rome. And they're using that and they're combining that with their also very firm belief in the story of the nativity and Christ's birth and life. And if you believe both of those things, if you believe that the empire sees everything and collects everything, and that Jesus was born on this date and in this way, then the empire must have seen it, and that information must be somewhere. And remember, Justin Martyr here is actually writing to the emperor. So he's saying to the emperor, go and check your files. So to kind of drag out some points which I think are worth thinking about there. So I think we see there that even in antiquity, right, I mean, right up to the present day, the history of this topic is highly polemical. It's highly charged. People have their own interests in this debate, as they did in antiquity as well, in those very rhetorical accounts that we just saw. And it goes right to the heart, I think, of how to model Christian pagan interaction. We saw in Chrysostom an awareness of an east-west split, so that there's different practice in different parts of the empire, but that also very much plays into those ideas we were just looking at about a Roman witness of Christianity. It's actually sort of useful for Chrysostom to be able to say, this is what the Romans do. The Romans have thought this, and there's a Roman witness, there's a Roman support for celebrating Christ's birthday on the 25th. But just, for my part, thinking about these scholarly approaches, if we think about the religious history thesis and the computational thesis theory, CT, I mean, we might ask, to what degree are those, or to what degree do they really have to be in conflict? Because you can easily imagine a universe in which there's a bit of both. Clearly, these people are sincerely trying to calculate the date that Jesus was born, and there's a complex arithmetic and lots of various assumptions which seem very illogical to us, but they clearly mean it when they do this. At the same time, obviously, if you're part of this world and you're familiar with a particular religious calendar, it's quite natural, I would say, to want to reinterpret events which are part of the cultural religious life as being particularly important to you as well. And I don't think that we need to see that as sort of necessarily deliberate or hostile. And that's sort of my core problem with some of this framing, is both of those approaches, they assume that Christian and Roman are sort of separate things, and one of them attacked the other and took it over. And it's this sort of, this hostile procedure of cultural appropriation. And that's the way I think it has sort of ended in popular culture as well. The idea that pre-Christian Greco-Roman antiquity is kind of the true one, and then Christianity comes on and grafts all this made-up stuff on it. But I think when we think of these people and realize that all these Christians that we talked about today, they were themselves Romans, then I think the story becomes a little bit more intelligible. It's not Christians stealing something from the Romans or from the Greco-Romans. It's Christians who were themselves Romans quite naturally coming up with a Christian Roman festival. And thank you very much.